In the last few years, psychology has developed names for nearly all the various classifications of symptoms with which the art is concerned. And for the general concept of a split personality, psychology has compounded a word which means this: schizophrenia. But, as in the case of the word psychology itself, the various professors of the subject are now departing radically from the meaning of the word, so that today in popular practice, schizophrenia is more or less defined as an ailment causing an individual to lose vital contact with his environment, with a resulting deterioration of his personality. Now, this is not exactly what the word means, but in common practice, this is what it has come to mean. Myself, however, I would like to bring it back to its original meaning and study it more or less in terms of what it implies, namely, a division or splitting up of the elements of the personality. It would appear to me that it is this splitting up which ultimately leads to loss of environment contact. The individual who is not united himself or in his own nature can never experience an organized or integrated world around him. Therefore, the divisions and discords in his own nature will gradually cause him to retire from areas of action in which these discords result in unpleasant occurrences. He therefore sinks into himself merely because he is ashamed or afraid. This shame or fear will result from the loss of adjustment with those around him, loss of vital interest in the affairs of his environment, and gradually he develops a tendency to nurse himself. And whenever we get to this point, we're in trouble. Now, most persons suffer from a certain degree of split personality, and within a certain so-called normalcy range, no especially desperate consequences arise. In fact, today we have a question which perhaps should be considered here so that you will all be up to date. And that is whether the self, as we know it, in the term of internal integration, has ever been experienced or studied apart from some degree of personality split. In other words, the very fact that we have a personality usually implies a condition of difference. And difference, in many instances at least, indicates some form of imbalance within the personality structure. Thus, even the best integrated person is, to a measure, revealing in his daily actions, tastes, interests, attitudes, qualities, which would indicate an unevenness or a measure of disturbance within the integration. It may therefore be said, in all probabilities, that a pleasant kind of abnormalcy may be regarded as normal and delightful. We are not quite sure that we know exactly what constitutes a norm, and our negative thinking on the matter would imply that if we had no pressures away from complete integration, we might be rather purposeless persons. We might fall into a rather negative situation. Apparently, it is irritation within our own personality which causes stimulation. And this stimulation, in turn, contributes to achievement in many fields. Thus, the prevailing attitude is that what we might term a normal person must be considered under two headings. Normalcy in its classical sense, which would mean well-integrated living, and normalcy in its practical or apparent sense, namely a constructive kind of imbalance, an imbalance which is productive rather than disintegrative. Now, for practical purposes, let us try to understand the basic concept of the personality. I think the old Asiatic philosophers have stated it more simply than most Westerns, even under the present interest in the subject. The personality must be regarded as a compound. What we commonly term the self is a mysterious kind of complex. It is an integration of some nature. It is a one made of parts. And the contributions of the various parts to the total picture or to the total concept means individuality. If all parts in all persons contributed in an identical way, then we would have a more or less routine problem, for we would have all persons very much alike in their reactions to practically every type of stimuli. This is not true. Yet we must also assume that a self, assumed or recognized in a purely classical manner, a self separate from all its parts, a self with a universal significance, a fragment of universal identity. Viewed in this classical way, it might not be unfair to say that all selves are alike. If there is a divine unit within the individual, it should be assumed that this divine unit, participating in the nature of divinity, would thereby be like divinity, and, by extension, each of these units in various persons would be alike. This lack of likeness, this obvious evidence everywhere available that the individual's personality is not like all other personalities, must lead us into the natural recognition that this selfness is modified in one way or another, so that it is not available in its pure nature. Now we know that where persons are of similar interests, or have profoundly contemplated similar subjects, there is a tendency toward agreement. Therefore, we may also affirm, rather pragmatically, that equal attainment in a similar field results in a measure of immediate understanding, which may well lead to compatibility. The problem of compatibility around identical or similar attainment is, however, complicated by emotional pressure. Individuals who have done the same work or have very closely approximated each other's attainments may still have strong opinion about things, and these opinions in turn can be dividing factors. Thus even the same degree of knowledge may cause difference by interpretation, and each individual must filter his knowledge through himself, through his life, through his environment, through the circumstances which have contributed to the forming of his character. As these circumstances do differ, even knowledge itself, a comparatively neutral subject, can take on the appearance of difference in various individuals, so that the same general knowledge will lead to different or modified conclusions, where again we will have an element of separateness entering into the compound. For our problems this morning, however, we want to assume that which is sound in principle, namely that integration for each individual means an harmonic relationship between the elements of his own nature. It means that the person takes in his own character a stand which he might well take in society among a group of persons. In our own living, each person is his own moderator. He must more or less act as chairman of a board made up of the elements of his own consciousness. And he must try to find various ways of arbitrating differences. Or if these differences are due to misunderstanding, increase understanding to the degree that the differences are no longer dangerous to the unity of the project. We like to think, for example, in the world that someday we will not need war, that it will be possible for human beings to sit down and arbitrate their differences. We would all be in favor of such a situation. When a family emergency arises, if there be a strong leading spirit in that family, an effort will be made to arbitrate, to resolve these differences, to clear misinterpretations, and restore a measure of cooperation. We would instinctively attempt this if we found several of our friends coming to an antagonistic attitude. If we find people who are losing touch with those around them, we do our best to bring insight and to take an attitude of neutral leadership, of trying to help in any way that we can to restore good feeling among those who have reached a degree of contention. Thus, around us, we see the work to be done, and we try to do it. But it seldom, if ever, occurs to us to apply these obvious facts to the integration of our internal lives. Probably the old problem remains that it is much easier for us to look out than it is for us to look in. And because our very faculties, by their combination, create a point of view, it is difficult for us to use these very same faculties to alter that point of view. Confucius doubted if it could be done merely by intense effort. He felt that the only possible way of altering this complex situation was to contribute new elements of knowledge, to educate the individual past the present impasse in himself. This is, of course, the most appropriate method. It is the only true therapy that we know. But as the individual may not immediately feel the incentives to self-improvement, we must also attempt to point out ways by which he may arbitrate through enlarging his perspective concerning the very problem with which he is dealing. Therefore, instead of thinking of ourselves as one internal, facing a divided world, it may be well for us to consider ourselves as a number of persons, each person having a disposition of its own. And in our personality, these various persons move behind the surface of our action, so that one moment we are occupied by one of these personalities, and in another moment by another one of these personalities. This is one of the essential lessons of Buddhism, namely that under any pressure, a phase of the personality can become dominant. And if this phase of the personality becomes suddenly dominant, or aggressive, or takes control of the total personality, at least temporarily, we then become merely the embodiment of that phase, rather than the embodiment of the total personality. We may say that within each of us are many separate units. Some have estimated as many as 40 distinct pressure units, through the chemistry of which the personality becomes what we daily contact and call ourselves. Several of these units, however, are not by nature able to completely dominate the personality under any condition. They represent supporting or sustaining elements of consciousness which can only work in unison with other units. But I think it is perfectly safe to say that out of this group, there could be considered at least 8 to 12 almost completely integrated subdivisions of the personality. Each of these integrated subdivisions is sustained by 3 or 4 basic faculties. So it has a compound in itself, and personality has to be a compound. Therefore, we may think of these several minor compounds as separate personalities. It is quite conceivable that any one of these could become a sufficient integration to sustain an individual life. In other words, if some creature in nature had only the faculties and powers of one of these sub-personalities, it could still live, it could still have some kind of a career, it could propagate its species, it could earn its living, and it could develop a certain amount of distinct individuality. Perhaps, therefore, the old philosophers were not so wrong when they pointed out that mysteriously within man all other creations seem to exist, that the individual carries within himself the world of the animal, the bird, the insect, all of these different spheres, represented by certain units within his own consciousness. Man is man because he has more of these units, and because he can combine them into a larger arrangement of faculties, and also because to all of those possessed by other creatures, he adds a mental coordinator. And this mental coordinator must in some way become finally the mediator or the chairman of our board of directors. Thus our sub-personalities constitute directorships. Necessary, but usually it is dangerous for one of them to come into complete control. It is more important that all of these separate directorates shall recognize that they are laboring for a common end, and this common end must be constantly maintained by the vigilance of the mediator or chairman of the board. Thus, in a business, if the advertising manager becomes too much concerned only with advertising and tries to elevate advertising above every other consideration, the business is liable to come into difficulty. The same is true of a member of the board whose great principle in life is expansion. He wishes to start new branches. He wishes to enlarge. He wishes to create greater productivity. He is fighting for immediate, rapid progress. If this man is not controlled, if he is not brought into a general pattern, he may cause the business to expand too rapidly and fall apart. Thus, each of the directors helps, but he cannot become a tyrant. If he does, he will ultimately destroy the corporation on whose board he serves. The same is true in ourselves. Each of these directorates within our own consciousness is valuable, has a positive and important contribution to make. But if this contribution is allowed to become excessive, if the balance is lost, we have a series of difficulties. In man, there are patterns also set up by various activities. These patterns are a little different from corporate structures. They require more thought and more care. We know, for example, that in man, faculties overdeveloped, or areas or groups of interest permitted to expand more rapidly than the total personality, not only become too aggressive in themselves, but gradually deplete surrounding faculties. Thus, a person who creates too aggressive a habit in some field of his personality dedicates too large a part of available energy to that area. This area becomes a kind of vampire, living off of other areas. And with the man, as this condition proceeds, the director or the moderator loses control. He loses the power by his own energy to combat or to overwhelm the excessive energy being expended on another faculty group. Due to this cause, a pressure, once out of control, increases, continues to draw energy to itself, becomes ever less mindful of the cooperation of other faculties, finally utterly disregarding them, or turning upon them with its additional energy and violently attempting to destroy them. Thus the individual, under such pressure, voluntarily may destroy all faculties or elements which would naturally recommend moderation. This faculty, which has taken over, becomes an autocrat, becomes a dictator, and finally brings the rest of the compound into the same sorry state that the European dictators in World War II brought their countries. They destroyed all the good that they early accomplished and brought about a ruin because they were unable to accept counsel, unable to apply moderation, unable to recognize limitation. And this is one point that is tremendously valuable. All separate faculty groups are limited. All of the subgroups which go to make up the personality are deficient in something. There cannot possibly be an all-sufficient subgroup. The dominance of a subgroup must therefore always be attained by loss of something. And as most of these subgroups represent a minority element in the personality picture, the loss is usually the loss of the majority good or the majority contribution. If a person has 40 faculties, and 6 of them unite to form a sub-power, and this sub-power takes over, then it is obvious that 34 faculties will be poorly represented and may ultimately not be represented at all. This would inevitably mean that any achievement of the powerful pressure unit must be hopelessly inadequate. It will represent a drive, but it will not represent a coordination. There is a common story which we all know, which we are seeing again reenacted in Cuba. This story represents the difference, for example, between a group of faculties that drive a man, as in the case of Castro, to the liberation of his people. And it is quite possible that this drive was originally quite benevolent. Having attained, however, the objective of drive, Castro, like Napoleon and many others, was faced with the problem of administration. It was necessary for him to administrate thoughtfully, wisely, and lovingly in time of peace that which he had achieved in time of war. It is now obvious that Castro was unable to bring about a new coordination of faculties. He had achieved an end by a certain group. Now he needed the other 34 faculties, and they were not available to him. As a result of that, when it comes to a different area of action, he is powerless. He is unable to escape from a small group of tyrannical impulses, which, having served their purpose, should have retired and given over to a new group. This did not happen. He was unable to make it happen. And in the smaller actions of life, most people are unable to make this transfer from one faculty integration to another. Also, it was not possible for him even to bring in these other faculties, to coordinate with or cooperate with the dominant group that he had developed. Therefore, he will lose in peace what he tried to gain in war. His own personality is not well integrated. Therefore, he cannot maintain the wisdom which must arise from a larger group of faculties. All other things being considered equal, it has been a philosophical truism from the beginning that what we call wisdom must increase according to the accurate use of all faculty potential. The individual who is able to function adequately with 10 faculties will be wiser than the man who has only 5. If he is able to bring in the testimonies of 20 faculties, he will be far wiser than the man who can use only 10. And what we term great wisdom usually lies in an area in which the majority of the faculties are at least cooperating, and their attitudes, their contributions are recognized. Thus we might say that a very wise person might be one in whom from 30 to 40 faculties are making contributions. Probably not perfect contributions, but they have been allowed, as in a democracy, to rise in their seat in the House or the Senate and make their contribution patiently considered by the coordinator. It is this receiving of contribution from other faculties that will bring about most of the ends that we require. Now, there are some contributions that are indispensable. There are other contributions which are desirable. Those contributions which may be regarded as desirable but not indispensable are for the most part the result of specialized faculties. Now, it is quite possible for a scholar, an artist, and a successful man to be partly tone deaf. It is quite possible for an individual to live a reasonably normal life and achieve a great deal in many fields, even though he may be colorblind. These, therefore, represent helpful faculties: the faculty of color, the faculty of tone, the faculty by which we gain a certain sense of distances and immediacies. These faculties are desirable and are certainly necessary to the final balance of the personality. But they may be regarded as faculties not immediately necessary to a degree of normalcy. There are other faculties which are absolutely necessary. Now, there are also faculties, the deficiency of which will have a serious bearing upon other faculties. And there are some, the deficiency of which is noticeable only within their own areas. For example, if a person is deficient, we will say, in loyalty, in those faculty combinations which give him a sense of loyal relationships, if this group is deficient, it will permeate nearly every phase of his life detrimentally. If an individual is deficient in what might be termed the domestic faculties, faculties which involve love of home, love of family, love of children, and the importance of these in daily living, if this area is deficient, it will certainly impoverish his life relationships and will make many other faculties less useful. For instance, the faculty of acquisitiveness, or the desire to make money. This faculty is influenced by purposes. And if the individual has no reason to succeed, and this reason usually lies in another area, he will then either not succeed, or if this faculty functions by itself, he will succeed for the sake of success only. He will accumulate for the sake of accumulation only, and will end a miser. Or perhaps, in this case, the antisocial element of schizophrenia will come in, and he will gradually become detached from society and fall into a serious mental pathology. These kind of conditions must cause us to recognize that the study of faculty balance in relationship to personality is a very large and important one. And this study we have to approach slowly. We cannot hope to cover all of the ground in a single discussion, or many of them. We can only point out certain general areas. Having determined or begun to recognize our inner life as a corporate body in which we are not merely a single despot, we are not able or equipped to neglect all faculties and proceed by will alone. In other words, to dash recklessly into a situation unsupported by skill or thoughtfulness. If, then, we are this compound, it is important that we analyze the effect of compounds inside of ourselves upon deportment on the outside. Due to the fact that the internal function of man, like most of the internal mysteries of life, is extremely rapid, we must come to the conclusion that whereas all external things take time, internal adjustments are almost timeless. We can have a very elaborate internal experience in a matter of a split second. Also, we can lose authority over ourselves and pass this authority to one of the subgroups in a matter of a split second. Actually, this transfer is induced largely by pressure of the personality and of circumstances. The individual gets up, and he believes as he rises in the morning that he feels good. This good feeling means that at the moment there's no argument inside of himself. He is not fighting himself at that moment. He is either happy at the thought that he has coordination, or perhaps it is a negative state, namely the Senate has adjourned for the summer. But in any event, he is not concerned at the moment. He has not much more than gotten up, prepared for the day when the phone rings. This phone call brings back into focus a nagging problem. It brings back into his attention a subject about which there has been dispute, discomfort, keen annoyance within his own nature. Almost in a split second, this thing which he believed he had in the form of integration is gone. And a whole series of sub-tensions begin to take its place. If he has developed a nice, well-established habit for worry, this may be one of the first to appear. And in that instant, the individual ceases to be himself. He becomes an extension of worry. The man is not worrying, he is worrying. The worry unit has taken over. Now, if we could imagine that this worry unit was a kind of dour-faced person, an extension of all the chronic worriers we have ever known, symbolically, we might not wish to suddenly find that this person has taken over the management of our brain and our body, and is going to lead us into all kinds of difficulty. But although we have, perhaps, a certain tendency to worry, we observe with our resources the chairman is still there trying to pound down the worrier with his gavel. Worrier is talking too much. The chairman succeeds. He silences the worrier. And we think for a moment that the situation is going to be well in hand. But hardly have we gotten rid of the worry problem before another one presents itself to our attention. We begin to feel that we have been injured. To get up feeling good in the morning and to start out the day and then have someone upset it all results in another type of reaction, annoyance. This annoyance is perhaps a little bit associated with self-pity, more faculties coming in. Why should we have to put up with annoyances like this? At that moment, we do not like to remember that everyone has them. Our own annoyance is important. Out of this comes a whole series of negative logic and certain other faculties involving intellectual procedures come in. They tell us that we should not have this kind of annoyance and that we shouldn't like a person who causes it. Therefore, our worry changes into dislike, and a group of emotional pressures take over. So suddenly we become the hating person, or at least the disliking one. And for the time that this dominates us, we are dislike. We have no immediate way of rescuing ourselves. We have stepped from one hole into another. But the chairman is still fighting to hold the meeting in order. He wants us to realize that a certain amount of worry within reason, consideration, is necessary to our problem. If we laugh it off and ignore it, we may be in a worse one. So the worrying element is a contribution from a director. It's all right as long as it does not become excessive. A certain resentment may also be apparently justified. We may have certain suspicions which we must later examine and consider. We must begin to analyze the motives behind the person who has caused this difficulty for us. Thus, suspicion, a tendency to be critical, may lead to investigation. But it is the duty of the moderator to keep the meeting in order. So finally, with a tremendous amount of effort, he pounds down and overwhelms this hating unit within ourselves. Then will arise the problem of solution. We will draw upon those faculties which are apparent or available to us, and we will ask the individual in charge of ways and means to get up and make his contribution. Now, the man who in charge of ways and means may be rather young and inexperienced. He makes a series of suggestions, sometimes contradictory ones. He really perhaps is a little baffled by the whole problem. He has not had the adequate training and skill by which he can thoroughly cooperate with this problem. So his contribution is vague, and none of the directorate is particularly impressed by it. It hasn't answered the question of the individual. So he turns to other groups of faculties, and an aged member of the firm gets up as one of the directors and says, "Let me have my say. I have been in this business long. I have had much experience, and I believe that with reasonable care and thought, this thing will work out. Therefore, I recommend a good, square, positive, creative faith. I believe that we have to hold a constructive determination. We can't afford to fall apart and enter into arguments. Right now, we need every faculty that we have. Therefore, we must have hope. We must have faith. We must have friendship. We must have understanding. We must have a certain sublimity, a belief in the reality of great good. Without all this contribution, the day is going to be too difficult." This old and wise legislator is listened to because the person in whose day these problems are arising has been thoughtful in this department and would like to hold a good attitude. So now, feeling a little better as a result of the cooperation of a more constructive group, he more or less allows this director to influence the others, and he feels that the day may not be so bad after all. So he starts out working with the problem in various ways, with faculties of reason and judgment all contributing what they can. They are now cooperating with a master faculty which has come in, and that master faculty is a constructive determination to think the thing through straight. All this chemistry goes on so rapidly that we do not know that it is occurring. But we do have a very strong probability of success, or at least of survival, if we permit the various integrations to all make a contribution to one point or to one purpose. If, however, we permit them each to have its own existence, each one advancing its own destiny without regard for the others, these faculties become as selfish as people. And in their selfishness, they lead us into sickness and discord. Now, we do not want to labor this phase of the matter, but the point does remain that under all stimuli, certain groups of faculties come immediately into activity. And for the time of their dominance, they determine the personality. When hate dominates, we are hateful. When worry dominates, we are worriers. Now, this doesn't mean that in the objective personality, the existence of hate causes us to forget the alphabet or the multiplication table if we've ever learned them. But it does mean that our focus of attention is upon certain negative and perhaps dangerous attitudes. if we continue to use this hate, we will gradually borrow from all faculties any skill they possess to advance the hate. If this is strong enough, we may ultimately become criminally involved. Revenge. And we will use faculties that might have made us successful in many fields of activity simply so badly that ultimately they will place us in prison. Many so-called more or less brilliant criminals would have been very successful persons honestly, and would have been able to succeed through the skills which they possessed, far beyond even their hopes of criminal gain. But because of this lack of positive coordination, because of lack of an adequate chairman on the ethical level, these persons misused their abilities and sacrificed what might have been respectable and honored careers. Now, we do not, most of us, go to this extreme, but we do face these different phases of our natures. If we do nothing about these phases by intent, we will continually do something about them by accident. They are competitive. And as one of them gains a certain subjective dominance, it will work on this continuously. And over a period of years, it will strive by conspiracy to take over the whole life. And wherever it does so, it causes disaster, because the individual cannot proceed adequately without the contribution of the larger part of his own nature. One term we apply to this procedure may be considered to be narrow-mindedness. Narrow-mindedness simply means trying to live with one small subgroup of faculties, or perhaps with all of the faculties, but with one subgroup acting as dictator. Broad-mindedness means our ability to bring in the assistance and cooperation of other faculties and have their contributions validly recognized. Now, broad-mindedness may also have its troubles, because if the person calls upon inadequately developed faculties, then their testimonies may not be correct, or they may be uncertain, causing the individual to fall into a negative confusion. Confusion can arise either from a conflict of strong faculties, or from an individual trusting a decision upon inadequately developed areas of his own consciousness. All of this adds to one final total, that the individual has a kind of instrument within himself, an instrument which is perhaps far more valuable, useful, and successful than any of these efficiency mechanisms and mechanical brains they are talking about today. But there is an instrument here. And this instrument, if properly used, and if properly considered, will do a great deal for man. Now, to operate one of these mechanical brains, which are now taking their place in industry, probably as the result of the individual continually failing to use his own, these mechanical brains have to be operated very skillfully. So an individual, to operate one of these multi-million-dollar trinkets, must take a very careful course. And the machine must also be maintained by a battery of experts to make certain that it is continually functioning at a maximum of accuracy and efficiency. If the average person would put the same time on his own internal machine, he would also have a properly operating one. But he will do a great deal to perfect an instrument outside of himself, and almost no effort will be given to perfecting the greater instrument which is within him. For there is no device that he can ever invent as important as that with which he is naturally endowed. The problem of finding this out has burdened us for many, many generations. Down in the daily problem of our own existence, a split personality can therefore be described in 2 or 3 ways. It can mean a more or less permanent split. A split in which 2 or 3 groups of faculties have created a feud. And on this feud they are going to function until death do them part. They are not going to give up. The individual, through long cultivation of attitudes, or through some shock which has suddenly forced a situation upon him which he could not cope with, this individual has gradually permitted a major division within himself. Now we know cases in which a split personality can be aggressively functioning on 3 or 4 group levels. There may be 3 or 4 relatively distinct personalities. Psychology now recognizes these within a person and even names them. So that person now has several names, one for each of his personality pressures. Or instead of this type of personality split, the individual may simply have an almost constant vacillation, in which the splits are so frequent that they become the personality. In other words, you have heard people say, poor Joe could never make up his mind on anything. Or we never know how he's going to act the next time we see him. He's not reliable. He's a jack of all trades. He is forever changing his mind. Terms of this kind, representing a well-established personality pattern, simply means a sloppy relationship between the basic personality entities. The individual has no longer a director, perhaps has never had one. He has assumed that a business can succeed without management, that a life can be successful without direction. Therefore, the administration of the career is left to momentary circumstances. Whatever phase of the personality is dominant at any moment will control at that moment. And then when some other stimuli comes along, another phase will take over. This type of situation generally does not get worse. It's bad enough to start with. But it leads to a habit which is not measured so much by mental disease as it is measured by lack of mental attainment. The individual who falls into this situation simply lives and dies in it. He's a good old Joe, but he doesn't get anywhere. He doesn't do much of anything. The moment a job has a little difficult, he quits. If he can't find a certain immediate satisfaction, he stops. And if he is challenged beyond the degree that he wishes to be challenged, he walks out. There is simply no clear pattern of discipline. Such an individual is not suited for responsibility, and if he has it, he finally leaves it behind in some way. He will not assume leadership of himself, but in spite of this, generally likes to be admired, which causes a little trouble, because it is difficult to admire something that is not admirable. This same Joe can be good-hearted, kindly, well-meaning. These are the things we can say about him. But he does not bring with him any resource, any purpose, any clear integration. Thus, we must divide our split personality situation into these two, a positive and a negative aspect. The positive aspect is that in which one or two faculties or groups of faculties or personality units become dominant. In the other type, there are no dominants. The individual has never sufficiently pointed his own thinking or his own career. He may have some attainment in many things. This might seem at first to be desirable, and I think it is desirable above a state of bigotry. But it is not usually successful, and the person is usually unable to achieve a place in society which he regards as necessary or proper to him. If when we strive to integrate, there are holes in which we simply cannot integrate, it simply means that there are areas of our natures which have been underprivileged. Now, underprivilege for the mature person has to finally be a matter of indifference. We all have the right, in one way or another, to attain sufficient growth of faculty to meet the need of the occasion. Now, faculties, even as the ones which we referred to as secondary faculties which appears we could get along without, or which do not need immediate conditioning, they may have their effect also by a kind of indirection, so we do not ignore them. We realize that the personality exists on several major levels, and that these levels have to be in order. As Plato pointed out, the only kind of government which can survive is the government in which the best leads. Only where merit, superlative merit, is at the top can we hope to have any later integration that is useful. In man, the supreme merit, the highest merit, must rest in the understanding itself. Thus, the beginning of a one-person personality that is constructive is that the best lead the others. Now, when we try to find a man to lead a corporation or other important compound body, we are usually willing to pick him from the most successful brackets, and also we are willing to pay him a very large salary for his judgment, his wisdom, and his understanding. We realize that on this level there is no such a thing as a bargain. The best will never be any too good. So we look for that which is most advanced and suitable. The same must occur within ourselves. True leadership must arise from an adequate area of understanding. The leader can only arise either from among the groups, or it must arise from the total personality of which the groups are parts. The best leader, the great leader, must ultimately arise from the total. The total integration is the leader. The self is the integration of the little selves. Therefore, if this integration is achieved, the self becomes the natural leader. In experience, however, there are very few persons in whom the self is the leader. It's possible that we should consider such persons with the great world teachers, the messiahs, the prophets, and the sages. In our actual operation, it is not yet apparently common for the coordination of the parts to produce a dominant unit. This is due to the unevenness of their own power. As an electorate, they are unable to elect the proper person. It's the same problem we have in politics. The electoral bodies are not strong enough. Their own wisdom is not great enough to determine the best candidate. So things go on by trial and error, usually with a great deal of trial and a great deal of error. So what we generally term the dominant or the leader is derived from one of the groups. The man who came up from the ranks. The faculty or power which we may consider to be the best of that material which is available. So that which is best, in the majority of instances, is that in which the essential values are strongest. This best divides career or character much as the old Brahmins with their castes. The best determine the levels upon which we can most readily and reasonably function. The best also may determine the specialization to which our lives will be largely dedicated. But the difference between the best and the tyrant must never be overlooked. Many faculties and individuals in moderate circumstances are honorable, but suddenly elevated to higher office and with large authority, they are corrupted. This happens within our own nature. We will say, for instance, that the natural instinct of leadership in us rests in our artistic faculties. By nature, we have the artistic potential. We view life with the vision of the artist. Our sensitivity intrigues us to poetry and music and painting and sculpturing and things of this nature. Thus, the artistic faculties emerge as leaders. And having become leaders, they must go in one of two ways. They must lead us further into themselves toward dictatorship, or they must lead us to a broader appreciation of all things, which means that they then cheerfully create an advisory board out of other faculties to help them to know how to use their artistry to the best advantage. We are now taking it for granted that the one-man corporation is extinct. We are also faced with the fact that in man, the one-man corporation as we have known it is also extinct. The individual with one purpose only is not achieving, he is becoming ill. And while our economics still presses this point, wanting us to specialize, specialization must be guarded with the greatest of care. A specialization, for instance, in industry or science, which is attained at the expense of art or artistry in consciousness, or is attained at the expense of sublimity, the higher intuitive and apperceptive faculties, or attained at the expense of the domestic faculties. Such an achievement will not lead to a successful person. It will lead to a sick person. He may or may not be recognized as ill, but he will not be happy. And he will not be a well-balanced person. And the moment we lose balance, we lose integration. So always with our development of leadership, we come to the final conclusion in life that we are born with the probability of a dominant group of faculties. The individual who from his childhood has only really one thing in his consciousness, and that is to invent, is born thereby with a strong integration of those faculties necessary for invention. And out of this will come the symbolic personality, the inventor. And his thoughts, his emotions, his life will gradually become centered more and more around this inventive core. And other faculties drawn in will contribute to the degree that they can make some offering to inventiveness. Their other aspects are likely to be ignored or neglected. So we have this kind of a personality, and we live with it. And we are registered not only by name, but we are registered by activity. When we think of Jones, we think of the inventor. And the moment we mention the name of Edison, we think of the inventor. When we mention the name of Lincoln, we think of the statesman. These names have become identical with the dominant personalities. Where a dominant personality of this kind emerges, where a child like Yehudi Menuhin begins to play the violin and never really departs from it, then we know that music is the core personality. That into this group of faculties, into this group of this area of consciousness, the greater intensity has flowed. We feel that this person will now be able to lead his life, that his musical intensities, his dedications, his aspirations for attainment in his chosen field will give him a strong integration, and that he will live thereby. Now, this strong integration was very obvious in the case of Menuhin. It was not so obvious in the case of Lawrence Tibbetts. Incidentally, many years ago, when I was leading the Church of the People, Lawrence Tibbetts made his first public appearance as a singer on Sunday morning in our church. Incidentally, here, however, you did not have that clear line of leadership. You had a leadership in which other faculties or factors began to affect the central core. Now, in a personality integration, if the central core receives sufficient libido, and this end intensity is continued throughout life, the person will be whatever this drive makes him. There is always, however, a graciousness about total leadership. An individual, for instance, in a corporation, who owns most of the stock, can delegate authority rather liberally, because he knows that in the final analysis he controls. In the conscious experience of the individual, the person who internally knows that he is integrated, at least on a focal area, can also be more generous. And most persons who are well integrated have a tendency to be generous. By that I mean a great creative person can afford to consider the development of other faculties. They will not endanger his central core. The great scientist, like Einstein, could well afford to play the violin. He found natural outlets to give other faculties of appreciation their place. The economist becomes the artist. The financier becomes the philanthropist. These individuals do not fear that their central integration will be damaged. They know that rather it will be enriched, and that the more that they achieve as human beings in a larger area of activity, the better and more safely they can support their primary objective. So the strong person is not afraid to give the other faculties of his consciousness an opportunity. The truly enlightened leader in industry or economics is not afraid of religion. He is not afraid of philosophy. But an individual precariously poised will desperately struggle to maintain what slight advantage he has, and will regard every subordinate element as endangering him rather than advancing him. The manager or boss who is not well integrated will always be afraid of his subordinates. He is constantly afraid that his own inadequacy will be discovered, and he becomes a tyrant to protect his weakness rather than his strength. The same happens in our faculty distributions. If we therefore find that we have a natural leadership, then our wiser course is to build into this leadership all that we can in the form of the cooperating testimonies of the other faculties. There is no doubt in the world that the violin helped Einstein to be a physicist, although the fields are apparently very little related. But all outside skill representing the release of faculties will finally cause these faculties to become better integrated, and will broaden and deepen the central focus until from its own center it gradually expands and draws into itself all of the subordinated faculties without becoming broken or disturbed thereby. So one strong area can draw the others to itself and use them wisely if it is wise in its methods of management. If, however, a personality is precariously poised, and there are 2 or 3 areas within the individual of almost equal strength, the danger of your personality split naturally enlarges. For example, in working on various aptitude tests, we occasionally find borderline aptitudes, in which it is almost a question as to which one is actually dominant. The individual has 3 areas in which he perhaps could function almost equally well. This means there are 3 little selves sitting in there, each one of which is as well equipped to take over as the others. By certain conditions, one of these little selves can be pushed into dominance, not knowing exactly what he wanted to do with his life, but assured by his friends and relatives that he has to do something. The young man, in desperation, throws up a penny or does something and decides on law. Then if his family is able to sustain him in this rather lengthy procedure, he becomes a lawyer. Well, if there were 3 of these little faculty groupings, and one of them indicated law as a good potential, the education, culture, development, and extension of this into his career will probably mean that this faculty group, this self, will emerge, take over, and subordinate the other 2. One of the others could have done the same thing had it had the same opportunity, but it did not. So it drops back, and the law becomes a more or less dominant. But the dropped back pair that were not dominant, but were almost dominant, very likely will continue to exercise a certain amount of pressure. And if by some circumstance the young man chose for his profession a subdominant, and there was one of these others stronger than the legal integration, then he may have trouble. If he assumes many responsibilities and becomes set in his pattern, willpower will come to his help. He will decide, this is what I have done, I'm not really very happy in it, but this I'm going to stay with, because it's all I can do now. To go out of it will mean to hazard too much. So the individual stays in it, but he has these two other nagging factors, which would like to have had their place in the sun. If for any reason this person suffers from a break in which his willpower or energy directive is weakened, or through a series of circumstances his disinterest in the thing he is doing becomes excessively exaggerated, so that this rather precariously poised positive ceases to dominate, then it is very possible that one of these other subdominants will take over. And we have an individual who rebels, who turns against something, who was raised in law and did very well until his family went on the rocks, and then the next time we find him, he was a beachcomber in Tahiti. He moved out on it. He had a subdominant ready to take over. He had certain other elements in his personality. Now, such a physical action is so obvious that we are accustomed to it. But where these subdominants within the nature do take over without any obvious change in physical condition, because the physical condition was not so set that a change would be evident, then we can have the beginning of the rise of these split personality factors. One thing we also realize is that as these faculty groups break up, they lose, as we said before, their total participation in value. A group of 4 or 6 of these faculties constituting a subpersonality can provide only a fraction of the perspective or the value or the integration of the total of which man is composed. Therefore, we note nearly always that your subpersonalities are below the level of your dominant personality, morally, ethically, aesthetically, and culturally. And as some of these subpersonality units may be comparatively without moral directive, we find that many of them become vicious. They are vicious simply because they do not include the area of our veneration or our idealism or our abstract thinking. Just as dreams can become vicious or malicious or terrifying because they arise from only a certain part of the brain's function, so a subunit in our total integration will always be less as a being than the complete pattern should normally be. Wherever we have the split personality, then, we begin to find what the physician says is the degeneration of the personality. This degeneration results from the total life, including the body, being under the control of a less and less moral power. The result of this loss of self-respect, self-integration, we find this power, this new subdominant, leading the individual into dissipation or excess or overindulgence, with resulting catastrophe to the body and to the entire personality. It is therefore always wise to remember that when we turn over any part of the government of the personality to a fraction or a fragment of our natures, we are lowering our threshold of ethics. We are becoming more and more unrealistic. We are becoming more and more vicious, until if by some chance a pattern takes over which has little more than animal appetites, then we become actually bestial. We go down the level because we can never go up from totality, always down or less from it. And the more we take away from totality, the less we are as persons. In practical experience, we can take a simple example. The average person does not have all of these fragments completely individualized. They merely represent pressures. But let us say for a moment that a focus of jealousy takes over. Paracelsus of Hohenheim declared that jealousy begins as an emotion or an attitude, but ends as an entity. That it is a kind of incubus that takes over like an elemental demon and finally tears us to pieces and drags us into disaster. Actually, these elemental demons are usually destructive subfocal points of the integration. And we start in by what we regard as a perfectly reasonable right to be jealous of someone. We begin to stimulate this faculty group, and we begin to use other faculties to support it. We use the eyes to see more of the things we want to be jealous of. We use the ears to hear more accounts which increase our jealousy. We use every thinking, rational power that we have gradually to support jealousy rather than to correct it. And gradually we create a little integration, a little geometric pattern consisting of the faculties which have been brought together for the purpose of increasing jealousy. As soon as these faculties form a compound, they form an entity. Now, this is a psychological entity, that is true, not a physical one. But this entity gradually can take over. If this entity takes over, we are not only going to be jealous, but we're going to drop on our ethical level. Not only are we going to be jealous and be a little ashamed of that, but we are gradually going to be less honest. We're going to lose morality. We're going to lose ethics. We're going to lose spiritual insight. We're going to lose happiness, adjustment, respect of our friends. Little by little, this jealousy unit, which may be only 6 or 8 faculties out of 40, forming a personality and taking over, is going to lower us as a creature, dropping us back by a sort of an atavistic regression. We're going to be more like something that was here and vanished 50,000 years ago. Little by little, our own being is lowered. And ultimately, our jealousy, if it becomes completely obsessive, may even lead us to crime, lead us to degeneracy, lead us to many difficult excesses. But by the time this has occurred, we have lost all ability to resist until, like a habit-forming drug, we slowly become the servant of this one fragment of our own personality. Another fragment can lead us to fanaticism. Another fragment can lead us to the life of the adventurer, which becomes too excessively lacking in responsibility. It can lead us to miserliness. It can lead us to almost any type of negative corruption. And any of these fragments, carried far enough and long enough, will lower the moral level. Thus, the physician, in his observation of the case, is justified in assuming that we are less moral beings as we descend, and that this lack of morality means the gradual disintegration of the personality. It means that the person retires into a sub-state of himself, something that he should have outgrown millennia ago. We cannot, therefore, afford to lose leadership. And for the person, leadership is really three things. First of all, the leadership of value, conviction, principle. The leadership of religion and philosophy and idealism within the self. This forms a hard core which uses a great many faculties to integrate it. Therefore, it should and must become dominant. This leadership, in turn, permits a secondary leadership in the form of activity, the profession, craft, trade that we choose, and which we practice under the benevolent direction of this primary leadership. We are then given a third area, an area which we might call opportunity area. We have established our integrities as a total. We have established our activity as the major subtotal under it, and constantly supervised by it. We then create an area of opportunity, which means a sphere for extending into the unknown being the things we do not yet do well, the experiences of phases of consciousness that are not yet developed. Therefore, we go out into our recreations, our avocations, our hobbies, our social contacts, our various mature studies, our relaxations and recreations. We are safe with them because we already have a firm core into which we are building them, and we also have a positive leadership of spiritual, philosophical value at the root of ourselves. Thus we grow, become more gracious, more skillful, better enlightened, and all these things that we do raise also our philosophical and religious insight. We now have a package. This package is relatively safe, and the individual who is able to maintain it will preserve health better than almost any other preventive therapy that he can possibly apply to himself. So we all should work in this direction, that these lesser parts of ourselves should never develop wayward personalities, that they should never develop an individuality in conflict with the total nature. And if in the development of ourselves we observe that this total nature of leadership is not strong enough, that is the first thing that must be worked with. There is really very little to be gained by psychotherapy if the basic integration is not strong enough to hold it. And the basic integration is almost totally a matter of personal decision, a dedication of some kind to that which is necessary, important, and next. Without that dedication, we cannot survive. And so religion and philosophy supply our greater dedication. Science produces or supplies us with our secondary focus of activity in action in life. And our arts provide us with this area of growing opportunity through appreciation. If we can hold these levels, then we will not be in conflict. But if we throw any one of these into opposition to another, then our internal peace of mind is destroyed, and we begin to break unity into fragments. And a person who is fragmentary inside himself is subject to complexes and neuroses and phobias of all kinds. But the person who has not permitted this conflict in himself will always have maximum resources available at any time, for he can draw by leadership all of the powers of his own nature to bear upon any problem that he immediately faces. In this way, he has the greatest possibility of solution with a minimum of expenditure of energy or mentality. If we can therefore begin to think of this little corporation within ourselves and how to bring it into a strong focal pattern, I think we'll all get along just a little bit better. Time's up. In connection with integration this morning, I'd like to mention the coffee break. We can all go outside and integrate around the coffee pot, which will, I'm sure, give a nice opportunity for friendly contact. And if you have a little tendency to a split personality, by means of which it's hard for you to, mingle with people a little bit, you are too shy or too sensitive for the coffee break, this can be the first major lesson. Just go out and get into it. I'd like to also announce our subject for next Sunday morning. We're going to take up an interesting problem under the heading of mythology or legendary. We all have a concept of the kind of deities that once ruled the world. In our own Christian faith, we have a concept of the kind of God by means of which this world was brought into manifestation. Now, recent centuries have changed our attitudes on many, many things. And the question now arises, has there been any change in this universe in which we live? How are we to adjust our present perspective to concepts which really do not seem to be as clear as they used to be? There were times when everything seemed reasonable. Today things seem unreasonable. Does that mean that the deities ruling high space have become unreasonable? Were they always erratic and we didn't know it? Or are they still reasonable and we still do not know it? This problem offers an interesting springboard for a discussion, I think, next Sunday morning. For the lecture of this morning, we have a publication or two to recommend to you, Vital Concepts of Personal Growth, and a little discussion of submerged personalities, which we think would help you. You can ask the friends at the book table. Now join the coffee break, and we hope to see you again next week.